Hey, Scott, first thing first, thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us on the Growth Mindset podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Irshad. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Scott, before we dive into introductions, the topic of today is basically global warming and climate change. And to be honest, I'm not an expert on that. But the idea was basically to have a conversation with you so that we could discuss about these topics
Yeah.
and see what we people should actually know. Right? In India,
hmm
we don't have a lot of awareness, but I think even in the West, there is some awareness, but there's a lot of noise and chaos. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But let's typically talk about that subject today. I want to first understand what exactly, based on your research, your studies, what exactly is global warming and climate change? Are they different? Uh, and
Yeah.
why should someone care?
Yeah. I think if we start there, and that's probably a good place to start. Like, what's the difference between global warming and climate change? Global warming, as I explain it, is one element of climate change. Obviously, everybody associates global warming with an increase in the global temperature, however minor it may be, with drastic effects. Um, Global warming is just one element of climate change because when you think about global warming, it actually contributes to much more than an increase in temperature. So that global warming element contributes to additional ice melts, right? So we think about Arctic ice in the polar caps melting. That results in obviously more water on the surface of this planet and ocean levels rising. Again, another element of climate change. And then we also see effects of that global warming increasing storm severeness, right? More severe storms, um, which is going to displace populations. And we can talk about, we can talk more about that. But that also includes, increased drought, right? So that small tweak through global warming has far reaching consequences when it comes to climate change. It is not just about the temperature of the air getting hotter, it is the temperature of the oceans getting warmer, right? And affecting life in the oceans. 75% of the species on this planet are ocean dwelling, and that part of the ecological system is key for our success. So I guess that's the quick answer to that question. Is global warming is just one element of climate change. Climate change has far-reaching effects over and above just the heating of air, greenhouse,
Mm.
additional greenhouse gases in the planet.
Yeah, so this is interesting. When we say obviously drought, obviously more wildfires, there are a lot of things that basically impact. But are these related to human? Like, are we doing something that is impacting global warming, or is there something by nature? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, you've got both sides of that equation. You have some pundits will say the the temperature changes are normal; they're bound to happen. And you have other pundits say, "Hey, listen, we are absolutely influencing this temperature change." And I think the research I've done, and the data that I've looked at, it's not even research; it's just looking at data. If you look at the temperatures, the average global temperatures up until about 1980, they were relatively flat. And 1980, we don't see a gradual increase as a normal evolutionary, change. What you see is almost a vertical spike in the average temperature of the planet, tied to fossil fuel consumption, tied to greenhouse gases, and all of that is and tied to agriculture, tied to food production, energy production. All of that is obviously affected by us as humans on this planet, and it's a direct result of what we are doing to what we are doing to survive and generate food, generate energy, generate transportation to move food from one place to another, and economies of scale, right? So that is where we are directly affecting that greenhouse gas contribution, and ultimately that's what's raising the temperature. It's the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, additional carbon dioxide, that are causing the increased temperature in the planet. So yes, we are a direct result of that, or a direct contributor to it.
Okay. What is this greenhouse gas that we're referring to here for people that might not know?
Yeah, so greenhouse gas is really an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the reason they call it the greenhouse gases, if you've ever gone to a zoo or an arboretum, or you just have a greenhouse in your backyard full of plants and trees, um, and you've ever gone into that environment from an external environment, it's much more feels much more humid. But in addition to that, there's an abundance of carbon dioxide in that environment. There's an abundance of chemicals in that environment that outweigh the standard distribution of oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, and other noble gases in our atmosphere. And the result is an increase in heat generation as a result of that escalated carbon dioxide, CO2, in the air in that environment. And that's precisely what's happening. Is all of this all this carbon dioxide that's been created in populates the air basically is turning our atmosphere on this planet into a large greenhouse, right? It's adjusting the levels of different gases in our atmosphere, and as a result, we're seeing that increase in temperature globally.
Makes sense. Now, if I'm not wrong, when I was kind of going through reading about this, I kind of heard that based on the research and the data that the temperature back in 1800s and the 1980s, I think that's what you were referring to, was
Yeah,
close to 1 degrees Celsius,
that's
right?
right.
But
Correct.
after that, now it's around 1.4, and people are expecting that in the next few years it's going to hit 1.5, which is
That's right.
obviously 50% way more than what the
Yes.
temperature basically should be.
Yes. That's correct. That's correct. That's exactly the what the data is telling us, and we don't have to go back far, right?
Yeah.
I mean, our recording, our recorded temperature data goes back to like the mid 1800s, and you don't need to go back farther than that, because you have a great baseline right up until 1980, and that's when the spike happens. And people say, "Oh, wait, here's the interesting thing." People say, "Oh, it's not a spike; it's only half a degree." But they don't understand the impact that that half a degree average has, especially when the planet hasn't seen temperatures of that height in hundreds and probably thousands of years. That has a huge effect on all of the ecosystems, as I mentioned, from ocean to polar ice caps. So yes, small increment, but huge percentage, like twice as hot. Can you imagine like the average temperature being, 2x what the average variation was previously? That's not something that's sustainable long term. And again, the planet is going to try and fix this itself. Like, we don't have to do anything. The planet will fix this. It will fix this by slowly getting rid of us and making it harder for us to survive. And that's the problem. It's a bit of a catch-22, because I do believe strongly in the circle of life, and evolution. And what will happen over time is, as temperatures rise, populations will have to decrease. We won't be able to feed ourselves. We won't be able to reproduce. And all of this will contribute to a population reduction. I mean, I've heard people reference, human species as a virus, right? We are, we are a parasite on the planet. And again, it's a balance, and the planet will balance the population And if it doesn't, we'll do it to ourselves,
Yep.
by
Yep.
not adjusting the way we're living and the way we're living sustainably
Yep.
on the earth.
And
Yeah,
I find this very interesting. I do hear a lot of people saying things like, "We are a virus. The world would be better without us." But then sometimes I wonder, like, seriously, like, if we are not there, then who's going to be here,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And uh, I find that really stupid when people say things like that.
Mm,
I think, yeah, living consciously does make sense,
exactly.
because we need to be aware. It's not only
Right.
us; it's probably people after our bloodline, the young kids, and that future generation.
Yeah.
But also there, as you mentioned, this is like a catch 22 kind of a situation, right? For example,
Yeah.
people can say, and this is something that I've heard, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, that we should eat more greens,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
that'll be good for the environment. But I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay, how is that related to global warming and climate change?
Yeah. So, um, and eating greens is probably a very specific, mechanism that people can, undertake to help. Um, Ultimately, it comes down to, living sustainably, um, living within the planet's means, right? And if you think about greens, if you think about eating more vegetables, the reason why that is helpful is because, simply put, it has a significantly lower environmental impact, right? If you look at the impact on the environment in growing a garden and, living off of that food in your garden versus raising cattle or raising livestock or, um, you know, processing some other type of protein, look at all of the effort that goes in, because what you're essentially doing is raising a garden anyways in the form of, feed for the animal. Then you're taking that feed, you're providing it to the animal is consuming it, the animal is converting that feed into energy and muscle and protein. Then you're processing that animal, to get the protein. Then you are, taking that waste and finding a way to deal with that. Then you're taking that protein. Now you've got to distribute that protein, and if you aren't raising this animal, in the vicinity of yourself, then you have to look at transportation, logistics, and everything to have that protein brought all the way to you, packaged in some way, shape, or form. You have to look at refrigeration and storage if it's not close to you, and how that affects the environment. Like, there are all of these elements that contribute to getting that protein to you, right? And listen to how complicated that process was compared to growing, legumes in your garden, which are a form of protein, right? Like, and again, I'm not one of those people that says, "Oh, we have to stop eating meat. Everybody in the world has to stop eating meat." But there's a couple of things that I think about. One is, we can eat less. We can definitely eat less meat. We can evaluate the types of proteins that we're eating. Maybe instead of beef that is raised hundreds of miles away, maybe we're considering chickens and fowl that are raised on our property. Maybe we are hunting deer and goats, in our area, and we're doing it less. We're supplementing that um, with a vegetarian diet, or more vegan like diet, to help reduce the pressure on the planet, right? The same way we ride bikes, the same way we walk, the same way we, you know, choose to recycle and not use, one-time use plastics. Like, all of those things contribute to our impact on the planet. And so, I know you just asked about eating greens, but that is just, that only opens the door to all of these other things that we could also be doing. The other thing, because you brought up food, as you know, I love to eat. So one of the other things that I have really aspired to is this concept of eating local, right? So once you decide to eat local, there are people that are fanatical about eating within a mile radius of their home, not 1 mile, but whatever they decide. I will eat within a 10-mile radius of my home. And what that means is I'm driving less to get what I need. The food is within this radius of my home, so there is less impact in the environment getting it, to me, right? And thinking about farmers markets where local farmers will bring their goods to a central location. I'll go to that central location. I will get that. It's fresh. It's organic. Um, Lack of pesticides is also, less of an effect on the environment and all those contaminants that we need to worry about. So when we think about eating, there's a lot of strategies around it, reducing the proteins you're eating, looking at the types of proteins you're eating. I did see a story around proteins and the protein value of certain crickets versus beef. Um, it soon, we will move to a point where there are much more efficient protein sources than beef to be consumed, and maybe that's what it results in. Maybe it results um, in us moving our protein source to some type of an alternative. I haven't done any investigation into artificial meat, like meat printed in a lab. I have not gone down that path. I hope I never have to. Um, but again, there are options. There are lots of options out there. And I think we'll talk about technology, later on. Like that's one way that technology is helping us. Technology is giving us the ability to create, you know, impossible meat or fake meat to
Yeah.
appease the people that need it, or prefer it, and helps, again, if we can scale, then it also helps reduce the impact um, on the planet.
Yep. I
Yeah.
love the part around how you've expanded and you've not just covered the green part, because I had a couple of questions tied to that
Oh.
green plans, but it's good that you've covered all of that that I wanted to
Oh,
basically touch upon
sorry.
on the entire conversation, which is good, the entire spectrum, because it is
Good.
good for
Good.
people to understand the whole story
Yeah.
rather than just pick bits and pieces of information. And
Yeah.
I think one of the key takeaways of all you mentioned with regards to eating, right, be it greens or anything, was
Mm.
sustainability, right? Like, how do you eat in a
Yeah.
sustainable fashion? I think that is the most critical thing that we should be asking. And obviously, there are multiple ways to do that. As you mentioned, there are a couple of things that I typically look at. For example, I was not aware of organic foods, let's say maybe a year ago. I was just
Yeah.
aware, I just became aware of that because of a health crisis that I had. But that's when I realized, the importance of having food that is local, that
Hmm.
is organic, and
Yes.
without any use of chemicals or fertilizers or pesticides, because then what you're eating, your body has to process that, and it takes a lot of strain on your bodies to get rid of all of those toxins out of your body. That's why people these days have kidney failures, heart
Yeah.
attacks,
Yeah.
all of these diseases that we have is because of the food that we're taking, and we're not being conscious of what
Yes.
kind of food that we should be consuming. uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead, you
I
wanted to
was
add
I was just
something.
going to say I think you've nailed it, right? Like if, and again, I am not a doctor, and this crosses over into, a completely different vein of a conversation, but I think sustainability is what's sustainable for us as an animal, and what's sustainable for the planet, right? So as an animal, you're right. Like all those processed foods that we're eating, all those non-organic foods that we're eating, I'm convinced, and I'm going to say I'm convinced, in my opinion, um, is a huge reason why we see, an increase in cancer, liver failure, diabetes. All of these things are a result of us putting things in our body that were never meant to be put in our body, right? And I think you're right. Like if like All these things that we're putting in our body weren't meant for our body. All these things that we're doing the planet were never meant for this planet. It's related, right? Like, we need to get back. Hate to say it, we need to regress to some extent, right? I feel like we've gone too far in one direction without consideration of this. Um, and we've abused, if the planet was our body, we have abused it like a college student for the last like 100 years, right? We've drank, we partied, we didn't care about, it didn't matter. We were young, we woke up and, you know, maybe we were, slow the next morning, but it didn't matter because we're fine a couple hours later. And now, like, I think about like what, what I'm realizing as I get older is that's not possible. You can't do the things you did when you were young. Like if I twist my ankle now, it's not, half an hour, it's a day of repair. And like, that's, where we're getting to with the planet. Like, the planet is saying enough is enough. The temperature's rising. The planet's going to fix itself. If we don't do anything, and it will find something else. It will find disease. It will continue to rise in temperature. Um, Droughts and all of the storms that we talked about will reduce the food. As food is reduced, we will not be able to sustain. So yeah, you're right on. Like, that realization is key,
Yep.
um, from a growth perspective.
Yeah, and I like the pointers that you mentioned with regards to, it's not only the greens. I mean, no, I particularly believe you need to have a good mix. Obviously, more
Yeah,
portion towards the greens, but also not
yeah,
totally getting away from meat, because as
yep,
me, I always like to kind of have a balance, right? Not becoming an extreme, or following a
yeah,
cult where you say, you know what, become a full-fledged vegan.
yeah,
Well, there are a lot of pros and cons. And at least
yeah.
at this point in time, I've seen more cons, because you briefly touched upon that industry meat. And
Mm-hmm.
I think a couple of weeks back is when I was researching about it. I just came through some studies and research, and there I figured that the kind of amount it takes for someone to produce just one, I think, a patty, was
Yeah.
like 20 times more effort than an
Right.
original meat. I mean, like,
Right.
okay, that's
Yeah.
that's crazy.
So
Now the kind of effort we are putting in.
yeah, what's the point, right? Like,
Yep.
if you're going to, again, I think the hope is probably that, hey, it takes 20 times the energy now, but if
Yeah.
half the earth was eating this, it would not take that much energy, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is, um, that's a risk that it never happens. We just continue to, invest that energy in creating fake meat or meat alternatives when it never gets to a scalable point that's actually saving energy for the planet. It saves animals,
Yes.
which in itself reduces the greenhouse gas emissions, but that's only part of the problem,
Yeah.
right? And so that's the challenge that we end up facing.
Mhm.
And if um, you think about that side of it, um, the vegan side, or the vegetarian side. Um, it's not that they're cults. I mean, a lot of them, for some people, it's a religious choice. For some people, it is um, a love for all living things. They don't believe in killing to survive, and that's fine. I mean, I can get those individuals. I mean, I understand their reasoning. I support their choices. I look at, when I think about, when you said cult, and diets, I started thinking about the current ones like keto and carnivore and all of these things, right? So yeah, culty, definitely culty, as far as, hey, you could do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. What I like to think about is a return to, this sounds so hokey, but a return to nature, right? Like, try to think about what I put in my body. And I do this for my dog too, right? Like if I think about what I put in my body, I think about, hey, would a human being, Homo sapiens, wandering the mountains of Europe, put this, cheese slice, this processed, piece of cheese slice that I've just unwrapped in plastic into their body, right? And the answer is no. They wouldn't have, obviously. Absolutely would have discovered cheese like when some of their milk went bad, and they would have probably found a use for it, or yogurt, etc. But that's different. And so I try and think about that, right? And getting back to, hey, we're an animal that has evolved to, consume things, and we've evolved to consume the things that allow us to reproduce, etc. So I try and think about that and continue, down that path, right? And it just happens that aligns with um, low impact to the earth when I do that, right? I'm consuming fruit without packaging. I'm consuming, whole grains without, processed wheat and ovens and gluten. I'm consuming eggs that are harvested and eaten, right? And so I limit the amount of processed food. It's naturally forgiving to the planet from a consumption perspective. And so that's a great way that, and I think it's an easy way that I can do that. And I started that way of thinking with my dog, because the family is always, oh, give it to the dog, give it to the dog, give it to the dog. And I was like, listen, have you seen a wolf out in the forest, you know, um, eating grapes? Have you seen a wolf out in the forest? Like, um, chewing on, a pizza crust? No, you haven't done that. Their bodies aren't designed for that. That's not a good thing. And so, think about what we're designed for. And doing that helps us ensure that we are honoring the planet that we're living on by again, um, following what our species would have done millions of years ago. Are we millions of years old? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Hundreds of thousands of years old, I
yeah.
think.
I know. I
Yeah.
think I've heard the brain is like a 2 million year old brain, but
Okay,
with
then. Then,
yeah, yeah. So
yeah.
God, but I'm not sure if when you say 2 billion years old, I mean there are a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah.
theories out there which are crazy. So I
Oh
believe
well, we
that's for
can't.
another
That's a
day. Yeah,
different. That's a whole other podcast, Irshad. If we start talking
exactly,
about those
exactly.
theories, yeah, yeah,
Now,
yeah.
there are a lot of pointers that you've mentioned, Scott, that I think are important for people to think about. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
we think, like, I know particularly a lot of people that say, you know what, all of this sounds good. But when it actually comes, are people walking the talk? And
Mm.
that's where it gets tricky, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I know whatever I talk, to what extent I carry it. Otherwise, I'm
yeah,
going to keep my mouth shut, because then
yep.
it's something that people will eventually figure it out, that okay, this person is talking something but he's doing
Mm-hmm.
something else, right?
Yeah,
But I've seen a lot of stories flowing around. Like, I think one of the major takeaways all of us can have is there is a role that all of us can play. I think one of the first one being becoming conscious of everything around us.
yes,
Once we actually start doing that, the way we eat food, the way we travel,
yes, yes.
the way we interact, from where you buy, where you sell, I think this is a way for us to start correcting things, because as you mentioned, this has
Yeah,
a ripple effect. For example, if there is twice or double the temperature, so for example
mm-hmm.
in Bangalore it's around, let's say, 35 or
Yep,
37. If you're
yep,
telling, let's say, after a couple of years it's around 75 degrees centigrade, how are you going to survive, right? That's a crazy amount. You think it's just 1.5%, but that's almost 50% hike. So if it's
yep,
double, it's going to get even more crazy for us. um,
yeah.
I know we've discussed a couple of things, but I want to quickly go ahead and give my listeners an idea around who they're listening to. So, Scott, before we
Oh,
dive even further, would you
sure.
like to share your story and
Yeah,
where you from?
yeah, absolutely. So, born and raised in Canada. I think a lot of my feelings about conservation and um, in global warming and all things Earth related probably came from my experience living in Canada and living close to the outdoors. Like ecology and conservation was a big part of our education. I was in the Boy Scouts growing up and spent a lot of time in the mountains enjoying the planet, and that love of the planet has probably driven me to care enough to take on some of these activities and these elements. I'm a fan of the outdoors, and I currently work in the tech sector. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about how technology is going to help us with this Irshad. And I did want to come back to that point you were making, is like talking the talk and walking the walk. I see the single biggest issue with global warming, climate change is it's probably two big issues. One is denial, right? One is the conflicting information that we have. I only assume that the conflicting information we have in the United States is to some degree international. I assume in India you have the naysayers, you have the people that say this is fake. I'm not changing anything I'm going to do. So that's one big problem, is that deniers. The second big problem is visual impact, right? Um, and that is to say, I can and you can. We can eat vegetables. We can ride our bikes. We can put solar panels on our roof. We can stop burning fossil fuels, right? But I will never see the impact of doing that, right? The impact of one person doing this has no bearing on climate change. The impact of 200, 2,000, the impact of 2 million people doing this um, may start to show some effect. But the problem is, as an individual, I don't see that. I don't see that effect. I don't see 2 million people doing the same thing, and so I go, why would I? Why would I do that? Right? Like, what is it that? Um, what is it that I need to do, and why do I need to do that if nobody else is doing? I think those are the big um, hurdles that we have for people. At some point, to your point, they just have to understand and do the right thing, regardless. And enough people are doing the right thing, and it doesn't matter. Um, but I think you're right. Like that's the challenge that we
Yeah,
have in
and
dealing with this.
exactly. And I think, Scott, that I think rather than worrying about if others are doing it or not doing it, I think the only thing that is in your control is you doing it.
Yeah,
And
you
I
got it.
think
You got it.
that's possibly a positive cycle that you can start, even though people
You
might
got it.
not be doing it. You start it. You be the first one if no
Yeah,
one else is. Even if you
you're right.
die trying, that's still fine. At least you're being conscious with
That's
yourself
right.
and you are true to
That's right.
yourself. And
There is. Oh yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say there is an element, right, of doing it yourself that is that encourages others,
Yep.
right? If you look around and nobody's doing it, and you don't like that shouldn't prevent you from starting. And then the next person that looks around sees you, right? Be the person that other people see, right? And be part of the problem or part of the solution. Don't be part of the problem, right? We've all heard
Yeah.
that. Um, but what's really exciting to me is um, how we're going to be able to leverage technology, right?
Yeah.
Because I think to date we've been we've been dealing with this problem in terms of um, okay, we've got the problem, but again, to your point, we don't know, we don't see the cause immediately, right? We see a temperature graph that's 150 years long, and it's starting to get bad. So we don't understand the real impact, and we're starting to see it on a regular basis: hurricanes, storms, droughts, those types of things. But that's only going to get worse. So ahead of that, we have to think about um, how we can address this other than telling everybody don't, stop eating meat, because that's not working, right? And
Exactly.
this is where I think technology um, plays plays a huge part, right? And it falls into several categories. I think technology can help us by gathering information. I think right now, we look at one data point, and it's the average temperature from 1850. Well, how is temperature measured in 1850? Where did they measure it in 1850?
Hmm.
What is the real average? Was
Exactly.
this measured at the local saloon?
True.
Um, or was this measured in 1,000 different places and averaged together? Excuse me. So what we can do with technology is we can leverage things like drones to understand uncivilized areas, to understand globally, what are our temperatures at ground level, at 1,000 feet, at 10,000 feet, like get a more holistic picture of temperatures globally, not just on the antenna in that certain location that's been in that location for 60, 70 years. The other element I consider when we're collecting that data is IoT, Internet of Things, right? There we have the ability to essentially develop this infrastructure globally that can be monitoring temperatures real time. It's not a matter of discovering this information after the fact, or recording and reading through logs of data to get this information after somebody climbs a mountain. Internet of Things is going to allow for this to be a mesh network of communicating devices that can give us real time data on, for example, heat sensors that are spread around the world, tracking this information live. Obviously, we have satellites. Nothing's going to change there. They'll continue to get better. I'm pretty sure the cameras on those satellites can see what I'm eating at my desk for breakfast. And that tells us that they have the ability to probably track, foliage and growth and agricultural health from space. And then obviously AI, right? So AI, machine learning, just because we have to talk about that with every technology conversation, is going to fill in the gaps, right? We're all going to have all of these data points from satellites, IoT, drones, however we're gathering this information. But AI is going to process that data. AI is going to be able to give us um, information around what's missing. Like, what don't we know? Well, based on this and that, based on these two, IoT sensors, there's a good chance of this, based on history, based on um, millions of terabytes of information. And then leveraging that AI to not only fill in the gaps for capture, but then leverage AI to model things into the future, right? Like, understand, hey, based on what we're seeing today, based on hundreds and hundreds of databases of modeling data, using AI to model out, what does storm behavior look like? What does water rise look like? What does temperature impact look like in all of these other regions, right? And using AI to see into the future ultimately can help us prepare. And you think about people that say, hey, I'm not making an impact, I'm not making an impact, I'm not making an impact. Oops. We just had, the sea just rose by a foot, and New Orleans is underwater, right? And so the AI can give us a preview into what's happening, right? And you've got the doomsday people that say, hey, we're at the doomsday clock. We're at 2 to midnight on the doomsday clock, and if we don't need to see something soon, it's too late. AI can give us an insight into what it's going to be, not tomorrow, but in a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and maybe incentivize us to take more action, more of us to say, hey, this is what's coming, this is where this is going. We need to take action. Obviously, we've got proof now. It's one thing to hear it from Al Gore in his presentation in his movie 20 plus years ago now at this point. But it's a whole other thing to understand here is scientific data preparing us for the future. And and then the the other thing we can leverage is not just AI telling us, but AR, right? Now, what if we were able to use augmented reality and see the impact, Irshad? So it's one thing for you to say, hey, AI tells us that the sea levels are going to rise by a foot in 10 years, 20 years from now. And the impact is the following cities will be underground. What if you could, put a headset on a young adult and they walked around their city, and instead of seeing their city as it is today, they were seeing their city as it would be affected by um, a foot of water rise, right? And the impact to the environment, they would be seeing the future, right? And again, adaptive behaviors impacting people with visuals is key for convincing people that something really needs to change. Um, and I think that's, those are huge, huge um, benefits and elements that technology can play in contributing to addressing the need for change. And we have to make the change. It's nothing, technology isn't going to allow us to, my view is technology is going to allow us to continue down the path we're on, right? We can't look to technology to figure out a way, oh, let me eat all the red meat I want. Let me raise all the cattle I want. Let me, waste, half of the grown food in this world and throw it in a landfill and generate methane gas and technology isn't about um, addressing the symptoms. I guess technology needs to educate us. We have to fix ourselves. Technology can't fix this problem for us. We have to fix ourselves, and technology needs to help us understand the impact, our progress, and um, show us show us reality and show us the future if we don't. So that's my technology thoughts on this process and this
No, I
topic.
think I think Scott, what you mentioned is beautifully put across because you've covered variety of things, especially things around AI. Because now everyone's talking about AI, and AI,
Yeah.
right? So it's
Yep.
important to see, okay, how can we leverage and how can we leverage AI to kind of make sense of things around us and what could be. It's a very good perspective to have. And also, I think what you mentioned with regards to uh, showing people, right, like an augmented reality, giving it to the youth so that they could actually see what it could be. Let's say if it was
Right.
hit by a storm, or what it could be, let's say with heavy
Yeah.
temperatures, heat waves, and so on.
Yes.
And there is research and data that backs it up, that visuals are 3 times more appealing than what you just tell to people, because it
That's right.
directly impacts your neural pathways inside your brain. It gives you connections. It stores those images in the unconscious so that you are aware that things like this will happen, like if you don't get our act
Yes.
together. uh,
Exactly.
one of the other pointers that I think is critical in this entire aspect, right, is technology. You briefly touched upon it, saying, it's on us how we use it, right? I think it's
Yep.
just like a sword, or a knife, you could say, right? You could use it
Yeah.
to cut vegetables, cook yourself a good delicious meal, or at the same time people can use it for other means like murder and so on,
Yeah.
right? It's just on us on
Yeah.
how we use the technology. And I think we need to become more conscious, and organizations also need to
Great.
become more
Yes.
conscious around how they could leverage so that it's more sustainable. What are your thoughts around what can companies do
Yeah.
that could make it more environmental friendly, I would say?
Yeah. I struggle with that question, right? Because organizations, I mean, depending on the organization, I think one, the single biggest thing an organization can do is recognize and support the need for change, the need for sustainability. Um, Ironically, you think about oil companies. It would be hard to understand, how they could do that, but it's possible, right? It's about reduction. It's about renewable energy. It's about moving your business to sustainability, the same way that we as individuals need to move our lifestyles to sustainable lifestyles. Organizations and companies need to do the same. SAP is a great example of this. SAP has made a statement around carbon neutrality. They will push for carbon neutrality in their business. And we can even see this at expos that they are hosting and participating in, right? They are reducing any kind of leave behind collateral. They are reducing any amount of printable material. They are conscious of their travel budgets and carbon credits in all of their international travel and logistics. And so organizations with that mentality that are raising awareness for their staff, that are giving them consideration, maybe benefits tied to their lifestyle and their ability to not drive to an office for 10 miles every single day, and facilitating a remote work environment. Policies around sustainability are key for company the same way they're key for employees. And again, that's just one more example of an organization where you look around the room, and if I see an organization doing it, maybe that incents me to do it. If I see my buddy doing this, maybe that incents him to do it. Um, but again, I think that businesses are corporate entities, and they have a role to play and a responsibility to play, um, or they'll be gone. You know, if there's no people that buy your products, yeah, then I guess your organization isn't going to be operating. So it's in their best interest to take the same approach when it comes to um, consideration of the planet.
Agreed. And I know a lot of companies. You mentioned one company that actually is incorporating that culture, right?
Yeah,
Providing support in terms of doing that. And you mentioned a
yeah,
very good point around how can organizations incentivize their employees as well for doing things of that sort, because obviously that helps not
hmm,
only specific individuals, it helps the company also set a good expectations, being
yeah.
more environment friendly as well. Now, what can policymakers do? Again, I know you're not a
Governments.
policymaker. Yeah, governments. I'm not going to
Yeah,
say you, but what do you
yeah,
think are things that we can keep in mind? Because I have
yeah,
people that listen to my podcast who are from government backgrounds in India. So
yeah,
this could be probably a way of
yeah,
thought, a perspective that they could
yeah.
look at.
So one thing to think about, and probably the biggest thing to think about, is awareness. And policymakers are in a unique position to have the loudest voice, to have the broadest audience, right? Like this podcast will touch 10 people. Policymakers will touch 10,000 people, right? So the message, it is their responsibility to ensure that the message of sustainability is received by everybody that they have access to communicate. Um, Now, from a policy perspective, they have the ability to enact policies that reward people for alternative energy sources, right? That reward people for reduction in waste, that encourage individuals to recycle and encourage individuals to reduce their footprint on the planet. And I think we think about specific things. I mean, policymakers. I remember growing up, right? So this is a good example, right? When I grew up, there was we had one garbage can. Well, we had two cans, but they were both the same, right? And they were in the back alley. You throw out all your garbage into the cans, and once a week, garbage truck come and take it away. But policymakers over time have said, hey, wait a minute, we need to do more than this. So then there was another can, right? Then there was a blue bin. So now you put your garbage in one can and the blue bin. Okay, we're going to put recyclables in there. Okay, great. So another 5 to 10 years go by, and now policymakers are like, okay, now we need a green bin because we're throwing a whole bunch of food waste into landfills, generating methane gas. That's producing, greenhouse effect. we need another bin. So now we got three bins. We got a green bin for food scraps and like grass clippings and stuff like that. So those policies, those views that have said, hey, um, there are measurable benefits to doing things differently, reducing waste, recycling plastics, etc. I don't know if this has happened in India, but we are moving away from single-use plastics completely in North America. I go to stores now. I get bamboo forks if I get takeout food, paper straws that I hate, that last about 30 seconds in your drink and then they're useless. But it's all about policy, and those are policies that have been enacted by policymakers. So I can't see into the future, but what we need to see is policymakers continue to do what they're doing and probably more aggressively, right? Like, we don't have 15 years to figure out that we need three bins. We've probably got about 15 minutes from an evolution perspective to figure out what's the next thing we need to do. It's probably water conservation. It's probably around water treatment, right? So um, I think I want to say, and I don't know if this was in North America, but it's at one point there was a water we are starting to see North American water shortages, right? And obviously places like Africa and third world nations have gotten into this situation where there is a water shortage of an emergency level. But like, we're starting to see that in first world countries, right? In North America, we're starting to get to the point where there's a water emergency, and that's scary because that is a result of all of these other things that are going on. The planet saying, hey, I've had enough. Like, sorry, you guys, you figure it out. So we think about policymakers, they need to continue to support that aggressively. They need to continue to fight that fight. We talked about the number one reason, or number one of the biggest contributors, is deniers and denial. And, they need to keep fighting that fight to silence the deniers or um, support the scientists, and ensure that their volume is louder than those that would have us do nothing.
Agreed. And you ask, I don't know, you said you're not sure about if the plastic thing happens in India. In India it does happen. I think right now
Mm.
there are two. If I'm wrong, that's my ignorance. But as far as I remember, it's two. I think one is the wet waste is what they call it. Right, so anything
Okay.
that is, yeah, so you typically have a different garbage can for wet waste and
Okay.
another one for dry waste, right? So you don't put
Okay.
food items in that, you don't
Hmm.
mix it, and you put it dry. So those are two separate
Got
things.
it.
That's what we are doing it. and
Got it.
and I don't know if you're aware, Scott, but Bangalore as well had the same issue a couple of weeks ago. I would say 2 or 3 months back is when,
Mm.
not at the entire Bangalore region, but a couple of outskirts of Bangalore were facing water crisis as well. Like,
Right.
there were apartments that are like, you could say there are around 5,000 people in that apartment staying, and there were multiple apartments like this where there was no water for like a week, for 10 days. People were actually going to malls to go
Yeah.
ahead and use malls
Right.
loo so that they could get some water, take bath there. It was that crazy. But and
Wow.
that's a good sign, that, right, that if you don't conserve, all of this is actually going to happen. And I think that the reason why that happened in Bangalore, and Bangalore is one of the greenest cities in India, right?
Right.
One of the issues that I sensed that happened was because there were a lot of cut down of trees that's happening.
Hmm.
Around 20,000 trees were cut, I think, a couple of weeks back, and there is around
Yeah.
80,000 trees that are in the works because of some or urbanization. There is
Okay.
actually kind of, I think, a rule or a thing passed that around 80,000 trees might be cut
Oh my.
to accommodate that. So imagine the kind of, obviously it's going to get more hotter in Bangalore as well. So we need to,
Yeah.
so that's why I ask you about policymakers, because it's important to understand that yes,
Yes.
urbanization is important, but we need to also take into consideration, okay,
Yeah.
at what cost are we actually going to urbanize, and consider this, that we are moving ahead, right? So that's important.
Yeah.
I think one
Yeah.
of the other important things to touch upon briefly, I would say, is uh, celebrities. I know there are a lot of celebrities,
Mm.
influencers that talk about
Hmm.
good stuff around
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
could have good impact, but there are
Yeah.
also some that might just take a private jet to a different state just to have a cheesecake.
Yeah.
People know
Yeah.
about it. I'm not going to name them, but yeah, there are a lot of fancy people out there who would prefer to do that. But I think it's important to understand who we take up as
Mm,
people that allow us to influence us, because end of the day, what you
yeah.
can do is in your control, and then rest, yeah, what's going to happen is going to happen. That there's nothing we can control outside of ourselves.
Yeah. We have the political policymakers, and then we have the non-political policymakers, right? The influencers, the people with money, the
Yeah,
people yeah, I agree. Like, I
yeah,
mean, and people, unfortunately, I don't think people are stupid, but when they see their heroes or they see their idols, right, not walking the walk, to use your words, then they're like, why would I bother? They don't. Well, I mean,
yep,
you have to be your own person. Yeah, I mean, you have to decide
yep,
what kind of how you want to leave how you want to leave this place.
exactly. And I know almost we are coming to the end, Scott, but I just like to kind of tell like some parting words to everyone that would be listening to a podcast. I think we have covered some very major important pointers, covering three different, I would say, phases that are really critical. One being the individual, which is the most critical because it starts from us. Then we went to the technological aspect, or how
Yeah.
organizations could become more aware, and then government policymakers altogether. The final,
Yes.
because when all of these three can combine and come together,
Right.
is when real change can actually happen. Um,
You're right.
Before we wrap, I just wanted to kind of probably ask you, I would say, two more questions. One
Oh,
would
sure.
be, um, is there anything, Scott, that you want to add that probably I might have missed that you think is important for people to know when it comes to global warming or climate change?
I think kind of the one thing I tell my kids is like it doesn't matter what you do as long as you're doing something. Like something's better than nothing. No matter how small, you know, even if it's using a water bottle, a refillable water bottle, right? Like not no one thing is too small, right? And 7 billion people doing small things can have a big effect. I think that's the best message to hammer home. This is addressable, and I think don't feel like you have to change your life completely. Small things. Think about that.
Love it. And one last question for people that might be interested, Scott, to probably reach out to you, follow you, how
Yeah.
can they find out?
Well, I don't have Instagram, so I through I think um, getting in touch with me, they can reach out to you and you can route them accordingly. Irshad, um, and happy to chat with anybody on the subject or any related subject from a technology perspective. Feel free to have them contact me through you.
Awesome. Perfect. So thank you so much, Scott, for taking your time out,
Thank you.
joining us on the show, and sharing some really important things that I believe are important in this day and time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It was a fun conversation, and I look forward to our next.
Yep. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thanks, Irshad. Take care.